The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant Michael Harrison adjusted his red tunic and checked his rifle one final time. After 15 years of service in the Queen's Guard, he had seen it all. Tourists snapping photos, children waving excitedly, and the occasional person who thought they were clever enough to make him break his stoic composure. Today felt different, though, and Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something unusual was about to happen. The crowds were already gathering despite the early hour. School groups clustered together with their teachers, pointing out the historical significance of the changing of the guard ceremony. Elderly couples held hands while reminiscing about their younger days. Street vendors called out their wares from nearby corners, selling miniature Union Jack flags and postcards featuring the famous red-coated guards. Michael took his position at the palace gates, his face a mask of professional indifference. His job was simple in theory but demanding in practice. Stand perfectly still, remain alert to genuine threats, and under no circumstances break character or respond to the endless provocations from tourists seeking a reaction. The Queen's Guard represented centuries of tradition and honor, and every man who wore the uniform understood the weight of that responsibility. As the morning progressed, the usual parade of visitors began. A young boy pressed his face against the iron railings, trying to catch Michael's eye. A teenager attempted to photobomb a family picture by jumping into frame at the last second. An elderly woman asked her husband repeatedly if he thought the guard was real or just a statue. Michael had heard variations of these interactions thousands of times before. Around midday, a man in his 30s approached the gates. Unlike most tourists who were content to observe from a respectful distance, this visitor had an aggressive swagger in his step. He wore expensive designer clothes and carried himself with the entitled air of someone accustomed to getting his way. His eyes scanned the area with calculating interest, and Michael instinctively sensed trouble brewing. The man pulled out his phone and began recording a video, speaking loudly to his camera about how he was going to prove that the guards were nothing more than tourist attractions. He boasted to his online audience about his plan to get a reaction, claiming that British traditions were outdated and that he could easily break their famous discipline. His voice carried across the courtyard, drawing attention from other visitors who began to gather around to watch what might unfold. Michael remained motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead, but his peripheral vision tracked every movement the man made. Years of training had taught him to assess threats while maintaining his ceremonial stance. This visitor was clearly seeking attention and validation from his video audience, which made him potentially unpredictable. The guard knew that most people who challenged the Queen's Guard were simply looking for entertainment, but occasionally someone crossed lines that demanded a response. The man circled closer, his commentary becoming more mocking and disrespectful. He made jokes about the guard's hat, questioned his masculinity, and suggested that anyone could do this job since it only required standing still like a mannequin. Other tourists began to look uncomfortable as the man's behavior became increasingly aggressive and inappropriate. Michael's training kicked in as he mentally prepared for whatever might come next. He had protocols to follow and a duty to uphold, regardless of how this situation might escalate. The weight of his rifle felt reassuring in his hands, though he hoped it would remain purely ceremonial today. The Queen's Guard had faced down much more serious threats than obnoxious tourists, but every situation required careful judgment and measured response. As the crowd grew larger and the man's behavior became more brazen, Michael knew that this ordinary Tuesday was about to become anything but routine. The visitor's need for viral content was pushing him toward a line that, once crossed, would trigger consequences he clearly hadn't considered. The guard's response, when it came, would indeed be anything but silent. The man with the phone grew bolder as his video gained viewers. Comments and reactions flowed across his screen, encouraging him to push further. He read aloud the suggestions from his audience, each one more disrespectful than the last. Some viewers dared him to touch the guard, while others suggested he try to steal the famous bearskin hat. The validation from strangers on the internet fed his ego and clouded his judgment about the seriousness of his actions. Michael watched through his peripheral vision as the man stepped closer to the restricted area around the guard post. Red rope barriers and clear warning signs marked the boundaries that visitors were expected to respect. Most tourists understood these boundaries instinctively, but this particular visitor seemed determined to ignore every posted rule and social convention. The crowd of onlookers grew larger, Sensing that something dramatic might happen, parents pulled their children closer while teenagers held up their own phones to record what was unfolding. A tour guide tried to diplomatically suggest that the man step back, but he waved her away dismissively, claiming he knew exactly what he was doing and that these guards had no real authority. Security cameras mounted around the palace perimeter captured every moment as the situation escalated. In the security control room, officers monitored multiple screens showing different angles of the confrontation. Radio chatter increased as personnel coordinated their response, though they hoped the situation would resolve itself without requiring intervention. The Queen's Guard had their own protocols for dealing with difficult visitors, and experience had taught palace security when to let those protocols play out. The aggressive visitor began making increasingly personal comments about Michael's appearance, his family, and his intelligence. He suggested that anyone choosing to stand motionless for hours must have failed at everything else in life. His voice carried across the courtyard as he performed for his growing online audience, feeding off their encouragement to become more outrageous. Michael's jaw tightened slightly, the only visible sign that the insults were registering. His military training had prepared him for much worse than verbal abuse, but protecting the dignity of his uniform and the institution he represented remained a serious responsibility. Every guard understood that they were not just individuals, but symbols of British heritage and military excellence. The man's girlfriend, who had been watching nervously from a distance, finally approached and tried to convince him to stop. She could see that other tourists were becoming uncomfortable, and that security personnel were beginning to pay closer attention to their group. Her pleas for him to end the video and move on fell on deaf ears as he became increasingly intoxicated by his online fame. Palace security officers positioned themselves strategically around the area, ready to intervene if necessary, but allowing the Queen's Guard to handle the situation according to their training. These officers knew that the guards were highly trained soldiers, not just ceremonial figures, and that they had specific procedures for dealing with various types of threats and disruptions. The man pulled out a marker from his pocket and announced to his viewers that he was going to write his social media handle on the guard's uniform. This declaration caused several tourists to gasp audibly, as even those unfamiliar with royal protocol understood that this would cross a serious line. The crowd began to murmur anxiously, as they realized they were about to witness something that could have serious consequences. Michael's training included detailed instruction on the escalation of responses, available to guards when faced with different levels of threat or disrespect. Verbal warnings, physical positioning, and ultimately more decisive action were all tools in his arsenal. The key was matching the response to the severity of the situation while maintaining the dignity and authority of his position. As the man raised the marker toward Michael's pristine red tunic, time seemed to slow down. The crowd held its collective breath, security officers tensed for action, and somewhere in the palace ancient protocols were about to be demonstrated with modern efficiency. The visitor's quest for internet fame was about to collide with centuries of military tradition and discipline in a way that would leave a lasting impression on everyone present. The marker was just inches from Michael's uniform when the guard's training took over. In one fluid motion that shocked the crowd into silence, Michael stepped forward and brought his rifle down with practiced precision. The movement was so swift and controlled that many onlookers barely registered what had happened until they heard the sharp crack of the rifle butt, connecting with the ground just inches from the man's feet. The traditional shout that followed echoed across the courtyard like a cannon blast. "Make way for the Queen's Guard." Michael's voice carried the authority of 15 years of military service and centuries of royal tradition. The command was delivered with such force and conviction that several tourists instinctively stepped backward. Despite not being the target of the warning, the aggressive visitor stumbled backward, dropping his marker in shock. His phone clattered to the ground as he lost his grip, the live stream continuing to record the cobblestones instead of his face. The confident smirk that had characterized his behavior for the past hour was replaced by wide-eyed surprise and growing awareness that he had seriously misjudged the situation. Michael took another measured step forward, his rifle held in the ceremonial position, but his presence now unmistakably that of a soldier rather than a tourist attraction. His eyes, which had stared straight ahead for hours, now locked directly onto the troublemaker with an intensity that made several onlookers shift nervously. The transformation from statue-like stillness to commanding military authority was complete and dramatic. The crowd that had gathered to witness entertainment found themselves watching something far more serious. Parents pulled their children closer, recognizing that this was no longer a harmless tourist interaction, but a demonstration of real military discipline. Tour guides whispered explanations to their groups about the fact that the Queen's Guard were active soldiers with real authority to protect royal property and maintain order. Palace security officers moved closer but did not intervene, recognizing that the Guard was following proper protocol for dealing with someone who had attempted to damage government property. The Queen's Guard had legal authority to detain individuals who threatened royal residences or interfered with their duties, and touching or marking their uniforms constituted such interference. The man's girlfriend rushed forward to retrieve his fallen phone, apologizing profusely to anyone who would listen. She had tried to warn him that his behavior was inappropriate, but now found herself in the embarrassing position of dealing with the consequences of his actions. Other tourists began to distance themselves from the couple, not wanting to be associated with someone who had so blatantly disrespected British institutions. Michael maintained his authoritative stance, watching as the reality of the situation dawned on the visitor. The guard's response had been swift, appropriate, and entirely within his authority, but it had completely shattered the man's assumption that the guards were powerless to respond to provocation. The rifle that had seemed purely ceremonial moments before now represented very real consequences for crossing established boundaries. Security cameras had captured the entire interaction, providing clear evidence of the visitor's attempted vandalism and the guard's measured response. Palace security protocols required documentation of any incidents involving threats to royal property or personnel, and this footage would become part of the official record of the day's events. The man stood frozen, unsure whether to retreat or attempt to salvage his dignity. His online audience, still watching through the dropped phone's camera, began commenting on what they had just witnessed. Many expressed shock at how quickly the situation had escalated, while others criticized him for pushing too far and disrespecting military personnel. Other guards positioned around the palace perimeter remained at their posts, but were clearly aware of the situation. Their stillness took on a different quality now, seeming less like decoration and more like coiled springs ready to respond if their colleague needed assistance. The coordinated awareness of the entire guard detail became apparent to observant tourists who began to realize they were surrounded by highly trained soldiers. The morning's entertainment had transformed into a teachable moment about respect, boundaries, and the serious nature of military service. What had begun as one man's quest for social media fame was becoming a viral video for entirely different reasons than he had intended. The silence that followed Michael's commanding shout stretched for what felt like minutes but was actually only seconds. The man stood motionless, his face cycling through expressions of shock, embarrassment, and growing anger. His initial surprise at the guard's response was quickly being replaced by wounded pride and the realization that his online audience had witnessed his humiliation rather than his triumph. Michael remained in position, his bearing that of a soldier ready to respond to whatever came next. His years of experience had taught him that some people, when confronted with authority, chose to escalate rather than retreat. The guard's eyes never left the troublemaker, watching for any sign that he might make another foolish decision that would require additional intervention. The man's girlfriend tugged at his arm, whispering urgently for him to leave before things got worse. She could see palace security officers positioning themselves closer and recognized that her boyfriend's internet stunt had crossed into genuinely serious territory. Her embarrassment was visible to everyone around them as she tried to minimize the situation and extract them both from an increasingly uncomfortable position. Other tourists began to murmur among themselves, some expressing admiration for the guard's professionalism, while others criticized the visitor's behavior. An elderly veteran in the crowd nodded approvingly at Michael's response, recognizing the appropriate use of military authority when faced with disrespect. Several people began taking photos of the confrontation, ensuring that the incident would be preserved and shared far beyond the original live stream. The man bent down to retrieve his phone, his movements careful and deliberate under Michael's watchful gaze. As he stood back up, his phone showed hundreds of new comments from viewers who had witnessed the entire confrontation. Many were mocking his failure to intimidate the guard, while others expressed shock at how quickly his confident demeanor had crumbled when faced with real authority. Palace security officers approached the couple with calm professionalism, their presence making it clear that the situation was now under official attention. They spoke quietly to the man and his girlfriend, explaining that attempting to damage government property was a serious offense, and that they needed to provide identification for an incident report. The casual tourist experience had suddenly become a formal security matter. Michael slowly returned to his ceremonial position, though his alertness remained heightened. The guard's transformation back to statue-like stillness was gradual and controlled, demonstrating the discipline that allowed him to switch between roles as circumstances required. His return to position sent a clear message that order had been restored and that normal operations would continue. The crowd began to disperse slightly, though many remained to watch the aftermath of the confrontation. Parents used the incident as a teaching moment for their children about respecting authority and following rules, while tour guides incorporated the real-time demonstration into their presentations about the serious nature of the Queen's Guard's duties. Security footage from multiple angles captured every detail of the interaction, providing clear documentation of the visitors' attempted vandalism and the guard's appropriate response. This evidence would be crucial if formal charges were filed or if the incident required investigation by higher authorities. The comprehensive surveillance system around the palace ensured that no detail was missed. The man found himself in the awkward position of explaining his actions to security officers while dozens of tourists watched and recorded. His earlier bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by the uncomfortable reality of facing consequences for his behavior. The viral fame he had sought was indeed materializing, but not in the way he had imagined. His girlfriend's mortification was evident as she realized that their vacation photos would forever be overshadowed by this incident. She had tried to warn him that his behavior was inappropriate, but now found herself equally implicated in a situation that could have legal ramifications. The romantic trip to London had taken an unexpected and unwelcome turn. The incident had transformed from entertainment to education, demonstrating to everyone present that the Queen's Guard were not tourist attractions, but active military personnel with real authority and serious responsibilities. The respect and boundaries that surrounded royal institutions existed for important reasons, and crossing those boundaries carried genuine consequences that extended far beyond hurt feelings or embarrassment. The security officers completed their preliminary questioning and informed the man that he would need to accompany them for formal processing. The attempted vandalism of government property, combined with interfering with military personnel in the performance of their duties, constituted serious offenses that could not be simply dismissed with a warning. His protestations that it was just a harmless prank fell on deaf ears as the officers explained the legal realities of his actions. Word of the incident spread quickly among the palace staff and security personnel. Radio communications buzzed with reports and updates as the event was documented and reported up the chain of command. The Queen's Guard took such incidents seriously, not just for the immediate security implications, but for the precedent they set about how royal institutions and military personnel should be treated by the public. Michael remained at his post, though the morning's excitement had noticeably changed the atmosphere around the palace gates. Tourists now approached with greater respect and awareness, many having witnessed firsthand the transformation of a seemingly passive guard into an active military authority. Children who had been running around freely now stayed closer to their parents, sensing the more serious mood that had settled over the area. The man's social media followers watched in real time as his confident live stream devolved into a security incident. Comments poured in from around the world, with many expressing shock at his disrespectful behavior, while others mocked his assumption that he could intimidate a member of the British military. The viral moment he had craved was indeed happening, but it was making him famous for all the wrong reasons. As security officers escorted the couple away from the immediate area for processing, other guards remained vigilant for copycat behavior. Incidents like this sometimes inspired other attention seekers to test boundaries, requiring heightened awareness from all personnel. The demonstration of consequences served as both punishment and deterrent, sending a clear message about the limits of acceptable behavior around royal properties. Palace administrators began the process of filing formal reports about the incident. The attempted vandalism would be documented in official records, and depending on the outcome of the investigation, could result in criminal charges or civil penalties. The man's assumption that his actions would have no serious consequences was proving to be dramatically incorrect. Michael's colleagues expressed quiet support for his handling of the situation during brief moments when protocol allowed communication. The guard community was tight-knit, and they understood the challenge of maintaining dignity and authority while dealing with increasingly bold and disrespectful behavior from some visitors. His measured but firm response had upheld the standards expected of the Queen's Guard. The incident began appearing on social media platforms beyond the man's original live stream as other tourists shared their photos and videos of the confrontation. Multiple perspectives of the same event created a comprehensive record that showed clearly how the situation had developed and escalated. The guard's professionalism contrasted sharply with the visitors' aggressive behavior in every recorded angle. Tour guides around London began incorporating the morning's incident into their presentations as an example of why the Queen's Guard deserved respect and what could happen to those who crossed appropriate boundaries. The real-time lesson in military authority and British institutions provided valuable context for understanding the serious nature of royal protocol and security measures. The man's girlfriend faced her own questioning from security personnel. Though her attempts to stop his behavior worked in her favor during the investigation, her visible embarrassment and efforts to de-escalate the situation demonstrated that she understood the inappropriateness of his actions, even if she had been unable to prevent them effectively. Local news outlets began picking up the story as videos of the incident circulated online. The confrontation between an entitled tourist and a disciplined military guard resonated with audiences who were tired of seeing people treat public servants and institutions with disrespect. The guard's response was praised as an example of how to maintain authority while remaining professional. The morning's drama had lasting implications that extended far beyond the immediate participants. Palace security protocols were reviewed and reinforced. Tourist education materials were updated to emphasize the serious nature of guard duties, and the incident became part of training materials for new personnel about appropriate response escalation. What began as one man's quest for social media fame had become a case study in institutional respect and personal responsibility. Within hours of the incident, the video had spread across multiple social media platforms, garnering millions of views and thousands of comments. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a clash between modern entitlement culture and traditional British values. The man found himself at the center of international attention, but not the kind he had originally sought when he started his live stream that morning. Legal proceedings moved forward with typical British efficiency. The attempted vandalism charge was straightforward, supported by multiple camera angles and dozens of witnesses. The man's defense team struggled to minimize the severity of his actions, arguing that no actual damage had occurred since the marker never touched the uniform. However, prosecutors emphasized that intent to commit vandalism was sufficient for charges, and the clear evidence of his stated intentions made their case compelling. Michael returned to his regular duties, though he found himself something of a celebrity among his fellow guards and palace staff. His measured response to the provocation had been textbook perfect, demonstrating exactly the kind of professionalism and authority that the Queen's Guard was famous for maintaining. Requests for media interviews poured in, though military protocol prevented him from speaking publicly about the incident. The man's girlfriend broke up with him during the legal proceedings, unable to handle the embarrassment and public scrutiny that came with being associated with his behavior. She issued a public statement distancing herself from his actions and expressing respect for the Queen's Guard and British institutions. Her measured response helped salvage her own reputation while highlighting the personal costs of his poor judgment. Palace tourism numbers actually increased following the incident, as people became curious to see the guards who had demonstrated such impressive discipline and authority. Many visitors came specifically hoping to witness the changing of the guard ceremony, with newfound appreciation for the military precision and tradition it represented. The incident had inadvertently served as powerful marketing for the seriousness and professionalism of royal institutions. Educational programs about royal Protocol and military service, expanded to include lessons about appropriate tourist behavior and the real responsibilities of ceremonial guards. Schools began using the incident as a case study in respecting authority and understanding consequences, while military academies incorporated it into training materials about maintaining discipline under provocation. The man faced substantial legal costs in addition to the criminal charges, as his actions had triggered extensive security responses and documentation procedures. The financial reality of his poor decision-making became apparent as legal fees mounted and potential civil penalties loomed. His quest for free entertainment had become an expensive lesson in personal responsibility. International media coverage sparked discussions about tourism etiquette and the treatment of public servants around the world. The incident resonated particularly strongly in countries with their own ceremonial military units, many of which faced similar challenges with disrespectful visitors seeking social media content at the expense of institutional dignity. Michael's family expressed pride in his professional handling of the situation, though they worried about the attention it had brought to their household. Military families understood the challenges of serving in highly visible positions where personal restraint and institutional loyalty were constantly tested by public behavior. The man's social media following did increase dramatically, but largely consisted of people who had come to mock his behavior rather than support his content. His attempt to build a platform based on challenging authority had backfired spectacularly, leaving him with fame he didn't want and legal troubles he couldn't easily escape. Security protocols around all royal residences were reviewed and updated based on lessons learned from the incident. The response had been appropriate and effective, but officials wanted to ensure that future similar situations could be handled with equal professionalism and authority. The balance between maintaining public access and protecting institutional dignity required constant calibration. The marker that had started the entire confrontation was retained as evidence in the legal proceedings, becoming an unlikely artifact in a case that would be referenced in legal and military training materials for years to come. Such a small object had triggered such significant consequences, illustrating how seemingly minor actions could have far-reaching implications when they challenged established authority and tradition. 6 months after the incident, the legal proceedings concluded with the man receiving a substantial fine, community service hours, and a permanent ban from all royal properties. The judge emphasized during sentencing that disrespecting military personnel and attempting to damage government property were serious offenses that reflected poorly on both the individual and their country of origin. The case became precedent for handling similar tourist misconduct in the future. Michael continued his service with the Queen's Guard, eventually receiving a commendation for his professional handling of the situation. His response had become a training example for new guards about maintaining dignity and authority while following appropriate escalation procedures. The incident had reinforced the importance of the Queen's Guard as both ceremonial figures and active military personnel with real responsibilities and authority. The viral video continued to circulate online long after the legal case concluded, serving as a permanent reminder of the consequences of disrespecting military institutions. Comment sections became forums for discussing tourism etiquette, military service, and the importance of cultural respect when visiting foreign countries. The incident had sparked broader conversations about behavior and accountability in the social media. Tourist behavior around royal properties noticeably improved. Following the widespread coverage of the incident, visitors approached the guards with greater awareness of appropriate boundaries and respect for their military service. Tour guides reported that their groups were more attentive to protocol explanations and less likely to test the patience of ceremonial personnel. The man eventually attempted to rebuild his online presence, but the incident followed him wherever he went. Potential employers, dating prospects, and even casual acquaintances could easily find videos of his confrontation with the guard. His moment of poor judgment had created a permanent digital footprint that affected his personal and professional opportunities. For years to come, educational institutions around the world began using the incident in curricula about digital citizenship and the permanent nature of online actions. The case demonstrated how quickly private behavior could become public scrutiny and how social media fame could transform from positive to negative in moments of poor judgment. Michael's family eventually grew Comfortable with his minor celebrity status, recognizing that he had become a symbol of military professionalism and appropriate response to provocation, his handling of the situation reflected well on both his personal character and his military training, making them proud of his service and composure under pressure. The Queen's Guard as an institution benefited from the incident's demonstration of their authority and professionalism. Public appreciation for their service increased as people gained better understanding of their dual role as both tourist attractions and active military personnel. The respect that had always been expected became more consciously offered by visitors who understood the consequences of crossing boundaries. Palace security continued to reference the incident in training materials and protocol updates, using it as an example of how proper procedures could de-escalate situations while maintaining institutional authority. The measured response had prevented the situation from becoming more serious, while clearly establishing consequences for inappropriate behavior. Years later, the incident remained a cautionary tale about the intersection of social media culture and institutional respect. The man's attempt to gain internet fame through disrespecting military personnel had succeeded in making him famous, but for reasons that continued to affect his life long after the original live stream ended. His story became a warning about the permanent consequences of temporary poor judgment, the marker that had never quite reached. Michael's uniform became a symbol of the thin line between harmless tourism and serious misconduct. The incident it represented continued to influence how royal properties balanced public access with institutional dignity, ensuring that future visitors understood both the privilege of access and the responsibilities that came with it. The Guard's response had indeed been anything but silent, creating echoes that continued to resonate through legal systems, educational programs, and social media platforms long after that eventful morning at Buckingham Palace. What began as one man's quest for entertainment had become a lasting lesson about respect, authority, and the enduring power of military discipline and tradition.